Hello, welcome to Wrestling with Poetry, Kalamazoo, Michigan's premier wrestling and poetry podcast. My name is Ish Klein, and this is the episode where we will talk about Gorgeous George. And the featured poet is David Kirschenbaum. David will read a Mark Bolan poem from Mark Bolan's poetry collection, The Warlock of Love. There are no questions this week, so I'll just jump in. Open quote. You gotta have a gimmick, polish your act. Boxing, wrestling, it's all a show. You gotta get the crowd to react. You saw that crowd out there. Most of them hated me, and the rest of them wanted to kiss me. The most important thing is they all paid their money, and the place was full. A lot of people will pay to see somebody shut your big mouth. So keep on bragging, keep on sassing, and always be outrageous. Close quote. That was Gorgeous George's advice to Cassius Clay, as reported in the book Gorgeous George by John Capoya. Naturally, Cassius Clay will become Muhammad Ali. Let me start from the beginning. With shoulder-length curly platinum hair and extravagant robes, Gorgeous George created the professional wrestling persona we know today. He entered the ring to the tune of Pomp and Circumstance, preceded by a valet who would disinfect the ring for him with Chanel No. 10 perfume before laying out Gorgeous George's special rug. The name of these valets were Jeffries, and then Woodrow, and later Sherry Dupree, who would become his second wife. He was not the first wrestler who pretended to be an aristocrat, but he was the most memorable because he was very verbal. For example, when the referee patted him down, he would say, "Get your filthy hands off me." He also acted it out with his whole body. He is also known for saying, "Win if you can, lose if you must, but always cheat." Shocking and easy to remember. His sobriquets were... A sobriquet is like a nickname that somebody else gives you. His sobriquets were the Toast of the Coast, Sensation of the Nation, the Human Orchid. Before we go too far, let me give you some background so you know what went into making Gorgeous George. Gorgeous George was not born a dandy. His original name was George Raymond Wagner. Butte, Nebraska, 1915, is where and when he was born. His father was an out-of-work house painter and his mother was an invalid. Trying to find work, the family went here and there, eventually ending up in Houston, Texas. By this time, George was 7 years old. And it's here in Houston, Texas, where George learned how to wrestle at the local Y. And he practiced by staging wrestling matches with his friends. By the time he was 14, he quit school to help out his parents with expenses. He would wrestle in carnivals for 35 cents per win. By the time he was 17, he was wrestling in professional matches. His parents would die before seeing George capture the Pacific Coast Light Heavyweight Championship. That would have been in 1939 when George was 24 years old. He was a skilled wrestler, but the crowds just weren't there for him. This was before he put on his persona. And the thing to know about it is, if you don't have a crowd, you don't have any money. There is conflicting information as to whose idea it was for George to become gorgeous. But fortunately, it happened, because without that transformation, there would probably be no professional wrestling as there is today. It really drew a crowd. George cheated. Okay, so here's what he did. He cheated in the ring in a flamboyant way. He dramatically ran away from his opponents. I've seen footage of him running away from an opponent and hitting the ropes really hard to slingshot himself into the wrestler's midsection. He was nimble, he jumped really high. Lou Thies, Michigan native, and the greatest wrestler of these early times, was impressed by George. He was really impressed by this agility and his rope work. But he didn't let George win. Lou was a serious wrestler, and he wrestled stiff. Wrestling stiff means that you don't hold back. You're genuinely wrestling, not easing the other guy to the mat. Also, Lou Thies appreciated the big crowd that George drew because it meant many people would see how good he himself, meaning Lou, was. So what was the thing that made George so famous and on such a big scale? Well, that was television. Everything he was doing, the camera loved. His zipping around the ring, his floppy blonde hair, his insults to the crowd and the referee. In fact, Gorgeous George on TV was almost as popular as Milton Berle. And for some, he was more popular than Milton Berle. For some, he was a major inspiration. But can a star shine this brightly indefinitely? No, it cannot. George died at 48 from cirrhosis of the liver. He left behind 3 children and his 2 wives, and probably a whole world full of people who loved him but who he never met. But what is Gorgeous George's legacy? Many figures were shaped by him. Here's a quote from Bob Dylan's autobiography, Chronicles 1. Suddenly the doors burst open and in came Gorgeous George himself. He roared in like the storm, didn't go through the backstage area. He came right through the lobby of the building and he seemed like 40 men. It was Gorgeous George in all his magnificent glory, with all the lightning and vitality you'd expect. He had valets and was surrounded by women carrying roses, wore majestic fur-lined gold capes, and his long blonde curls were flowing. He brushed by the makeshift stage and glanced toward the sound of the music. He didn't break stride, but he looked at me, eyes flashing with moonshine. He winked and seemed to mouth the phrase, "You're making it come alive." Bob goes on to say that this encouragement sustains him to this very day. So Muhammad Ali, as was mentioned earlier, took a lot of George's act to heart. Can you think of any boxer as articulate and captivating as Muhammad Ali? I can't, but I don't follow boxing, but there might be somebody. And me, yes, I am definitely appreciative of the work of a talented heel. I think in earlier times in my life, I don't think I would have understood that it was an act, but now that I can, I do appreciate it. And that's a good lesson for those of you who are looking to learn something. Thoughts? Comments? Questions about any of this topic? Why don't you send them to wrestlingwithpoetry@gmail.com, and I will address it directly on the air, and that would be exciting. Now let's hear from a contemporary poet, David Kirschenbaum. David A. Kirschenbaum, boogcity.com. This is the author of the July Project 2007, open 24 hours, a series of songs about Star Wars set to rock and pop classics. His work has appeared in Brooklyn Rail, Can We Have Our Ball Back, Chain, and The Village Voice, among others. Kirschenbaum is the editor and publisher of Boog City, a New York City-based small press and electronic newspaper now in its 32nd year. He is the director of the biannual Welcome to Boog City Arts Festival, entering their 18th year this September. I can attest that is a phenomenal festival. While in high school in the early 80s, he attended a wrestling meet to see his friend Barry compete. Barry blaming his defeat upon his opponents doing something to Barry's balls, which at the time David can't recall. So Barry lost a wrestling match because somebody messed with his balls. Back to the bio. His Gilmore Girls tinge poems form the lyrics of Preston Spurlock and Casey Holford's band, Gilmore Boys. And you can check out Gilmore Boys on my www.myspace.com/Gilmore Boy Music. So let's give it a listen.
Hey everybody, this is David Kirschenbaum from Boog City. My good pal Ish asked for people's words on wrestling, and so I employed our Boog City Poetry Roulette formula and searched for the word wrestling in my hard drive. And this was one of the first things that I came up with and I thought would be fun to read today. My best friend Risa Morley is a huge fan of Mark Bolan from T-Rex. So years ago, I took his book, The Warlock of Love, and published an edition for her specifically as a present. So this is from The Warlock of Love by Mark Bolan, published by Lupus Music, copyright 1969 from Mark Bolan. In the hall, high above the ceiling, the furnace heaters blew. Black Hat fondled his white lashing hair. His avalanched glacier diminished in the artificial suns. A leg quivered, river green and massive, like girders of sea gold. A roar grew in the wrestling room of daybreak. Black Hat tittered with prideful delight. Mine, he moaned, the melting water scurried down the appropriate channels. And now, where once stood solid water, stood the reptile king, Tyrannosaurus Rex, reborn and bopping.
Thank you, David. That was amazing. Events this week. As usual, Satellite Records has its open mic on Thursdays in Kalamazoo, Michigan from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. The location of Satellite Records is 808 Southwest Nedge Avenue, and like I say, it's in Kalamazoo. How about you wrestling fans? Well, Independence Pro Wrestling has another match, and it's on July 8th. This match has a title. It's called Aftermath. Independence Pro Wrestling Aftermath is going to be at Watermark Brewing, and that is 5781 St. Joseph Avenue, and that will be in Stevensville, Michigan. And the doors open at 6, and the match is at 7 p.m. Well, thank you so much for listening. Until next week, this is Ish Klein Wrestling with Poetry. Thank you.